Hi guys, hope you're doing well. One thing I want to do here is a prophecy update with the things happening in Russia and Ukraine and some other events occurring. I thought was fascinating. There was recently a magnetic storm that basically destroyed some of the satellites that were launched by SpaceX. And I talked about SpaceX before. Drink a little water, sorry. I talked about SpaceX before because I honestly believe that either that or something like it with the amount of satellites that are being launched, if we are living in the last days, I think SpaceX and Starlink satellites might necessarily be used in ultimately the communication and the which will be used for the mark of the beast in some way, form, or fashion of transmitting information and its fast latency times and all that stuff and low atmospheric stuff. Because you always wonder how in the world we would have global communications and all this stuff with all the events talked about in Revelation. But it makes sense because it's so resilient because of the sheer number of them and how they can maneuver and move from bad things occurring and still retain their integrity as a satellite system as a whole. Well, just recently that magnetic storm basically wound up destroying 40 of the 49 satellites that were launched. And a lot of people look at it and go, boy, wow, you lost 40 of the 49 satellites, from this massive storm that took place. And it's like, well, true, but they have over 2,000 satellites up there. And that was just one launch, and 9 of the 40 survived. The other ones are burning up in the atmosphere, supposedly. And the other ones are perfectly fine. It shows you that they have resilience. They show you that they can survive big storms like that. So, and their goal is to have 12,000 roughly. So you're talking about the amount of launches they're doing. It won't take very long before they start having, we're talking about probably somewhere in the neighborhood of, who knows, maybe 2 to 4,000 this year. I mean, you're talking about a lot. I mean, they're launching them all the time. So a number of them up there. So within a couple of years, you're going to easily be at 6,000 satellites, and then beyond. And then you remember, you still have the tribulation period of time itself where they continue to launch. As some get destroyed, they launch more. And they're launching, like I said, 49 of them are launched. So they're launching multiple ones at one time. So if 100 get destroyed, it wouldn't take very long for them to replace those very quickly. So I think that it's showing its resilience in this destruction, not its weakness, as it were. And so when people look at that, I think some people read that and they think, oh boy, wow, can we really trust that? I think you look at it and you go, wow, that's really resilient. And the number that they can put up there and how quickly they can do it is, just amazing. How many have already been put up there. So I think the foundation for the mark of the beast, the hardware, as it were, to allow for Satan's control of this world through the Antichrist is there, and it's happening right in front of us if you're paying attention. So just thought you might find that fascinating. Now with the events also we should be looking at is Russia and what's going on there, and that is that Russia, it looks like might actually invade Ukraine. We'll see. God knows best. He knows what's going on, but keep that in mind. Be praying for the people in Russia. Be praying for the people in Ukraine. Be praying for the people in that general area. We have Christians, brothers and sisters there. We need to be praying for them, and that they can find safety. And, many of them have all kinds of things going on, medical needs, physical needs, children, small children, shelter in a cold environment. You lose your heat, you lose your electric, you lose your gas. You're talking about people who can freeze to death. It's very harsh winters. When you live in the northern hemispheres like that. So we need to be praying for them severely. In all seriousness. So be in prayer for them, I remind you. But so we see Russia becoming more militarily aggressive and adventurous, as I've talked about previously. Well, I think they've painted themselves into a corner, and I think that's what's happening. I think Putin, he keeps saying that it's NATO and all this other stuff. It's not necessarily the case. I think it's because he's, the way his administration and Russian government as a whole has treated the nations around them, that's why they have so few friends. You start looking at the nations around them, besides Belarus, Armenia, and a few of the stands, they really don't have anybody around them that trusts them, or put any confidence in them, or wants to be allied with them. Instead, they're reaching, I think Lithuania just asked, from what I read, just asked for a permanent stationing of American troops in their country. Why? Because they don't want Russia to come into their country. And they see the antagonism and the adventurism that Putin is increasingly becoming, which I think is, a testimony or a shadow of things that are going to be coming pretty soon, that Russia is forcing itself into a corner. It will become a pariah nation. It will be a nation that will be considered, that people won't want to trade with. Europe will become closer to NATO, not further away. Just like Lithuania is asking now for permanent troops, American troops to be stationed there. Poland has asked for more troops, as I understand. So you're talking about, they want those troops, aircraft, and so forth to be stationed there to give them security from this, threatening Russian bear that to come into their nation. So you have what we would see prophetically is what we're interested in as Christians. We do want to certainly pray for those people. I mean, this isn't a game. This is serious business with people's lives at stake. But I think what you're going to have is, again, Europe is going to pull away from. They're already talking about scrapping the Gulf Stream deal with Russia, and you're going to see Germany is. So you're going to see, again, this is going to hurt Russia. Already has, even if he doesn't invade Ukraine, it's going to, just the sheer actions that he's been doing, and these threats of, you have to do it my way or else type deal. We want all NATO out of Eastern Europe. We want to reset the clock back to 1989, before that, so we can have influence with these partners and basically, in essence, dictate who's going to be their leaders and who you're going to trade with. And what Russia, in many cases, did, they basically just lived off of, in a lot of ways, the nations that were around them that were part of their Soviet empire. And they really just drained the resources from those places, so those people lived in perpetual poverty, while they basically brought a lot of that natural work elements of money and so forth back to, to Russia, and really, so he wants to reset that clock, and you can't set back time. And I think this is very prophetic as Christians we need to be looking at, and that is that Russia is pushing itself to become a pariah nation, and that Europe is going to reach out for its natural gas, oil, and things like that from somewhere else. Ideally, it's going to wind up being Israel and the pipeline that they've been trying to push through Greece and on up into Europe. I think that's going to happen, and I think Europe's going to help facilitate that. I mean, we saw where Turkey is now trying to reach out to Israel and say, "Oh, can we work together?" And you can bring the oil and natural gas up to Europe through us instead of Cyprus, obviously. And that's why that's why in essence he invaded Cyprus again. And brought more troops there in essence. And they're there illegally. Nobody recognizes their control over Cyprus, eastern Cyprus, northern Cyprus, whatever it is. And yet Israel's taken it to Cyprus and on up, kind of bypassing Turkey altogether. And that's why Erdogan's been acting, there for a while, like the ridiculous person that he seems to be as a leader towards Greece and so forth, because he doesn't want that pipeline going and bypassing him and going up into. And he's got this disposition of, insane hatred of Israel for some reason, and he wants to see himself as this, great, Islamic leader of the Islamic world. Is how I think he's kind of sees himself, and it paints the perfect picture. It really does. It makes it perfect. Where, as Russia is going to continue to be now ostracized by Europe, East and West. Not trust it. Nobody's going to trade with him. Nobody's going to deal with him. It forces him into the arms of the more Islamic nations, the stands, on down to Iran, Turkey, and Turkey also is same thing. Turkey's wanting to say they want to have new relations, reset relations with Israel. But does Israel really trust them after all the stuff he's done? I don't think so. I think the Israelis are far smarter than that. But yeah, so ultimately, at the end of the day, what we see is Russia being pulled into this conflict that will ultimately, we know, is the Gog-Magog war. And the hook that will go in its jaw is that it doesn't have anybody to trade with. It doesn't have anybody to sell its goods to, as it were, because nobody's going to trust them, except for just a few, various nations around the world. That's really going to economically hurt Russia, especially if Europe cuts off buying oil and natural gas, which is 40+%, really up to 60% when you talk about all the derivatives and everything else that's associated with oil, natural gas, and so forth that comes out of the natural resources that come out of of Russia into Europe. When that's cut off, I think it's going to push Russia. That's going to be, in a lot of ways, could be the hook in the jaw that forces, because they're going to need income, money. If he wants to stay in power, he needs to find some fresh source of income control, and he needs to cut off that oil supply from Israel, going up into Cyprus and into Europe. And I think that's why in their meetings together between Iran, Turkey, and Russia, I think Putin has stated very clearly, do what you can to stop that pipeline from going into Europe, do whatever you got to do. And Turkey's looking out for their own interest and saying, well, hey, maybe we can have the pipeline come through here and we get a cut. He's already shown that they're willing to get a cut of oil from ISIS, which they did, and reportedly they did, and resold that oil at a very bought it at a discounted price and sold it on the market level and pocketed all the money. And that's, from my understanding, it was Erdogan and his son who ran that company, but her son did, and made out very well. And since his father's in control, nobody says nothing. So basically he was contributing, giving money to the people who are cutting off the heads of Catholics and Christians and Yazidis and so forth, and raping and pillaging, while he was getting rich. I mean, he's going to have to answer for that, but that's basically what happened, from what I understand, as being reported anyway. If what's reported is true, which I don't see why they would, it's not true. Somebody was buying that oil. They were definitely selling it. The trucks were going up through Turkey, and American bombers were bombing them if the person got out of the truck. But strangely enough, Obama had a rule that they couldn't bomb them if the person was in the truck. Quite odd. And nobody investigates Obama either, which they should. Anyway, so as Christians, and we look at what's happening, I think we see the alliance forming, and not only that, what's going to facilitate Russia to be pulled into this Gog-Magog war. And so keep an eye on what's happening right now. If they go in or not, I personally think they might actually go in and take the eastern part of Ukraine, and they could do that very quickly. I think the western side gets a little more tricky, and they can get bogged down and find themselves in a prolonged type of conflict, draining them of money and resources and people, which means it's going to force them to become even more militarized and more adventurous militarily. That's going to be, I think, what we should be looking for in the near future, because as you start to use your resources, it costs money to have those soldiers and equipment and everything sustained, food, equipment, weapons, and you're going to see the Ukrainians, I think, fighting from the west, being motivated to retake that land, and they're going to be getting money and weapons and equipment from various other surrounding nations, and maybe even NATO Western nations for sure. You're talking about a protracted war, kind of like what you saw with Donbass and what was taking place in Crimea, Donbass, and so forth in Ukraine, on up to the rest of Ukraine fighting against Russia and its the forces there that are pro-Russian in Ukraine. You can clearly see that happening. So I mean, here you have Ukraine, and up in this general area you have like Crimea. You have the river going through here. You have the Crimea, and then you have Donbass and stuff up in here. Well, and they were fighting for all this period of time. A couple of Ukrainian cities, and you have Kiev obviously down here. Well, that's you could see where Russia would basically come in and take all the way down to that river point, down to Crimea. So Crimea all the way on up where Kiev is at, they could literally take that, and they would leave only this kind of southwestern type of part of Ukraine. And Ukraine's obviously a fairly large, probably one of the largest countries in Europe, land-wise anyway. At you're looking at almost 42 million people. He increases his population by nearly, let's say 15 or 20 million people. And I think that's what Russia is also on his mind, is that not only does Russia have no trading partners and people that they can trust as allies, really, of any substance, any power, because of their actions and how they painted themselves in a corner. He's blaming NATO expansion, all this other stuff. These are sovereign nations who have a right to be in whatever, alliance they want to be in, because they're sovereign nations. What he's saying is, you don't have that liberty. You don't have that free will to choose for yourself. You don't have that sovereignty to choose what alliance you're going to be in. It's a threat to us. It's a really foolish argument. It doesn't make any sense. No one's going to invade Russia. Nobody wants to invade Russia. I mean, nobody's right mind is a massive land. He doesn't need any more land. It's a very foolish move. So you have to think, why would he do something that's so foolish? He's a very smart politician. He's a very smart person, by all accounts. Why would he do something so foolish? And you have to think that, ultimately, God's allowing for demonic influences or to manipulate him to do something that's self-destructive, not his own interest, similar to what we saw in Babylon and other things. Those kind of kings, when God makes them or causes them to do stupid stuff, like Pharaoh. He, in essence, destroy their own kingdom, through the hardness of their heart and really unwise counsel. Well, in a lot of ways, maybe this is what's happening to Putin. And so we need to keep an eye on that. Certainly things are moving. Prophetically, we need to keep an eye on that. And yeah, I think, what he's losing is his population as well. I mean, you got to remember, not that long ago, population of Russia was like 170 something million people. They're at like 140 something million now. There's like 30 million people are gone. And, in a very short order, they're going to be down around 120 million, potentially even lower. You're talking about maybe 110, 100 million. You got a population problem. It's aging. You have a high count of abortion, low birth rate, because it's just they can't afford to have children. You can't afford to have 6, 7 children. So they have one. That's really what happens. Throughout Europe and really the world, because it's so expensive. Both people working, they can't afford daycare. They can't afford to take care of their children, so they have one kid. And so the population is soon going to be halved. They don't have a massive immigration issue like you see primarily in the West, where you see an influx of people coming into Europe. You see an influx of people coming into America and Canada, and you see an influx of people going into Australia and stuff. The populations are growing simply through people, through immigration, legal and illegal. You don't see that in Russia. You do see people go in there occasionally, for sure, but not on the level or mass level that he needs, I think. And taking over Ukraine would automatically probably increase his population by 20 million, or somewhere in that neighborhood. And again, helps him kick that can down the road, as it were, of a population problem as well. Only thing that makes sense. Could be something else, but anyway, that's the only thing that makes sense. Anyway, we need to keep an eye on that. I thought you might find that fascinating. Keep looking up. God bless. Be safe. And we'll see you next time. See you. Bye.